"Please, don't take the cloth off," she begged. But the giant cowboy did, and fell to his knees. The church bell tolled. Dust swirled in the winter light. A widow's trembling hands laid down a cloth woven with faith, blood, and memory. The townsfolk whispered, "Blasphemy, fraud, betrayal." Then the cowboy tore it away. What he found beneath stopped his breath and changed his soul forever. But this was no simple act of reverence. That cloth hid a secret that could shatter. The valley, a deed, a promise, a fight for water that could leave ranches ruined and families broken. The cattle king won't stop until the widow is destroyed. The townsfolk are choosing sides. And the cowboy must decide: protect his land or protect the truth. One act of mercy has become a battle for faith, justice, and survival. When the flames rise and the town turns against them, will kneeling at the altar be enough, or will it cost them everything? Your reactions remind me why these stories matter. If you still believe in the quiet power of love, justice, and truth, then you're part of the reason I keep sharing them. The morning sunlight filtered through the church's frosted windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards. Outside, snow drifted down in lazy flakes, dusting the shoulders of late arrivals as they hurried inside. The small sanctuary filled with the sounds of boots, scraping against the entry mat, and coats rustling as people settled into their usual pews. Maria Jezabel Montoya moved with careful grace toward the communion table, her steps measured and deliberate. In her hands, she carried a cloth that seemed to hold stories within its very threads. The weaving was exquisite, intricate patterns that spoke of two worlds meeting. The Christian cross stood proud in the center, while around it, a patchy beadwork. Designs flowed like a river of memory as she laid the cloth across the wooden table. Her fingers lingered on its surface, remembering the hours spent weaving love and loss into every stitch. The morning light caught the delicate beadwork, making it shimmer like morning dew on prairie grass. The murmurs started soft, like wind through dry leaves, then grew louder. Some voices held wonder at the cloth's beauty, others sharp with judgment. Maria could feel their stares pressing against her back as she smoothed the fabric one final time. "That don't belong here," a voice cut through the whispers. Thomas Bedford, one of the territory's wealthiest cattlemen, pushed to his feet. His face had grown red above his starched collar. "That's heathen work, mixing with Christian symbols. It's blasphemy." Maria's hands began to tremble, but she kept them pressed flat against the cloth. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't take the cloth off." Her words carried the weight of years of loss, of love, of bridges built between worlds that others sought to keep apart. The congregation seemed to hold its breath as heavy bootsteps echoed through the church. Joseph Boone's massive frame cast a shadow over the communion table as he approached. Standing well over 6 feet tall, the rancher was known throughout the territory for his size and strength, but also for his fairness in dealings. Now his face was set like granite as he reached for the cloth. Maria's heart thundered in her chest, but she forced herself to step back. She watched as Joseph's large hands gripped the fabric, ready to strip away what he surely saw as an offense too. Proper worship, but as he lifted the cloth, time seemed to slow. There, lying on the scarred wooden table, was a Bible. Its leather cover was worn smooth by years of faithful hands. But what caught every eye was the dark stain that marked its pages, blood that had dried to the color of autumn leaves. The cloth slipped from Joseph's fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. His legs, strong enough to brace against the worst mountain storms, suddenly gave way. The entire congregation watched in stunned silence as the giant of a man fell to his knees before the communion table. The thud of his knees hitting the wooden floor echoed through the hushed church. His broad shoulders, usually squared against the world, curved forward as if bearing an invisible weight. His calloused hands, which had only moments ago reached out in judgment, now hovered uncertainly over the blood-marked Bible dot. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the silence. He shifted from foot to foot, his eyes darting between the kneeling rancher and the congregation. Clearly unsure how to proceed with his carefully planned service, Maria stood perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on Joseph's bowed head. The man who had approached with such certainty now knelt in what looked like prayer, or was it shame? She couldn't tell if this moment would bring understanding, or if it would fan the flames of prejudice higher. Snow continued to tap against the windows, nature's quiet rhythm counting the seconds as they stretched into minutes. The congregation remained frozen in their pews, witnesses to something they didn't quite understand but could feel in their bones was important. Joseph remained on his knees, his head bowed before the Bible that told its own story of sacrifice and understanding between peoples. The morning light caught the tears that had begun to track down his weathered cheeks. Though he made no sound, Maria's fingers twisted in her skirts as she watched him, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. The cloth lay forgotten on the floor between them, its carefully woven symbols, a bridge between worlds that suddenly seemed less distant than before. The gentle tap of snow against glass continued, marking time in this moment of transformation, where judgment had given way to something deeper, something that might be the beginning of understanding, or might be the spark of greater conflict. Only time would tell in that frozen moment. With Joseph's head still bowed and the congregation holding its collective breath, the simple church held within its walls a tableau of the territory's heart, its conflicts, its prejudices, and perhaps its hope for redemption. Thomas Bedford wasn't finished. The cattleman's boots clattered against the wooden floor as he strode toward the communion table, his face flushed with righteous indignation. The reverent silence that had fallen over the congregation shattered like thin ice on a winter pond. "This ain't about no cloth or Bible," Bedford declared, pulling a folded document from his vest pocket. The paper crackled as he shook it open. A supposed water rights agreement signed by her dead husband. Maria's eyes widened as she recognized the document. Her fingers clutched at her skirts, knuckles white with tension. That paper claims to give Apache families legal rights to half the valley's river water, Bedford continued, his voice rising. "If this fraud stands, every rancher here loses grazing land we've worked for years." Gasps rippled through the pews. Someone muttered, "Lord have mercy." Another whispered, "Can't be legal." The sound swelled like wind before a storm. Joseph Boone remained on his knees, but his broad shoulders straightened. His weathered face, still damp with tears, turned toward Bedford. When he spoke, his deep voice carried the weight of long-buried memories. "I fought against native peoples in the war," he said, each word seeming to cost him something. "Followed orders that shame me still." His large hands, calloused from years of ranch work, trembled slightly as he pushed himself to his feet. "Maybe it's time we listened instead of fought." Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill. "Brothers and sisters," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "this is a matter that requires both prayer and proof. We cannot act in haste." The congregation shifted restlessly. Some nodded at the preacher's words, while others scowled. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the general store, pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Her husband leaned forward, whispering something to the man in front of him. Bedford folded the document with sharp, angry movements. "Proof," he spat. "The proof is in our grazing rights. In our livelihoods outside, the snow had stopped falling. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes stirred up by the congregation's unrest. Maria stood silent through. her dark eyes moving between Joseph and the cloth that still lay crumpled on the floor as the service ended. People spilled out onto the snowy street. Groups formed quickly, heads bent together in urgent conversation. The morning air carried fragments of whispered words. Can't let them take the water. Never seen Boone act like that. Ought to run her out. Maria emerged from the sand. The church alone, clutching her Bible and the cloth close to her chest. A path cleared before her as she walked, people stepping back as if her presence might contaminate them. Only old Mrs. Wilson offered a small nod of acknowledgement. Joseph watched from the church steps as Maria made her way down the street. Her straight back and measured steps spoke of dignity in the face of scorn. He found himself wondering what strength it took to carry such grace under the weight of so many judging eyes. As dusk settled over the valley, Joseph finally mounted his horse for the ride home. The day's events played through his mind like a fever dream. The cloth with its mixed heritage of symbols, the blood-stained Bible, Maria's desperate eyes as Bedford revealed the document. Each hoofbeat seemed to echo the moment his knees had hit the church floor. The last light was fading as he reached his ranch house. It stood alone against the darkening sky, a solid shadow against the purple mountains. Inside, he lit a single lamp, its yellow glow barely pushing back the gathering night. The flame flickered. As he moved through the quiet rooms, his footsteps heavy with the weight of memory. Finally, Joseph knelt beside his cold hearth. The lamplight cast his shadow long against the wall as he bowed his head. His lips moved, forming words he hadn't spoken in years. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't rightly know how to do this anymore." He paused, struggling to find the words. "But I reckon you're still listening." The lamp's flame danced, sending shadows skittering across the walls of the empty house. Outside, a coyote called into the gathering night, its lonely song echoing Joseph's solitary prayer. The morning sun cast long shadows across Joseph's barn as he distributed hay to his horses. Steam rose from their nostrils in the crisp air while they nickered softly, pushing against his hands for treats. The familiar routine usually brought him peace. But today, his thoughts kept drifting back to the church service. Hoofbeats approached outside. Frank Wilson, his closest neighbor, rode up on his paint stallion. The man's face was pinched with concern as he dismounted. "Morning, Joseph," Frank called out, stomping his boots to ward off the cold. "Figured I ought to ride over, seeing as we're friends." Joseph nodded, continuing to feed the horses. "Something on your mind, Frank?" Words spreading about yesterday. Frank leaned against the barn door, his expression troubled. "That business with the Montoya widow, folks are taking it hard. Carson already said he won't buy cattle from anyone who sides with her." Joseph's hands stilled on the hay fork. Carson was the biggest cattle buyer in 3 counties. And Thompson's threatening to pull his hands from any ranch that supports her claim. Frank added quietly, "You've built something good here, Joseph. Be ashamed to lose it over some mixed-blood woman's story." The words hung in the cold air between them. Joseph resumed his work, each fork of hay landing with deliberate force. "Much obliged for the warning, Frank," he said finally, his voice level. "I'll keep it in mind." Frank mounted up with a sad shake of his head. "Just hate to see a friend make trouble for himself," he said. Turning his horse toward home, Joseph watched him ride away, the weight of choice settling heavy on his shoulders. By noon, he'd made up his mind. Saddling his bay gelding, he rode toward the river where Maria's cabin stood on disputed land. The afternoon sun glinted off fresh snow as he approached. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of piñon wood. A small figure in a red shawl played in the yard. Maria's niece, Lucia Letters. She looked up at the sound of hooves, her dark eyes curious but wary. "Mama Tia," she called out. "The big man from church is here." Maria appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She stood straight and dignified despite yesterday's ordeal, though Joseph noticed the tiredness around her eyes. "Mr. Boone," she said carefully, "what brings you to our home?" "Ma'am," he touched his hat, "thought we might talk, if you're willing." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Come in from the cold. Lucia, bring in more wood for the fire." The cabin's interior was humble but orderly. Woven blankets in rich earth tones decorated the walls, their patterns similar to the controversial cloth. A single Bible sat on a rough-hewn shelf, and bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a subtle sweetness. Maria gestured to a chair while she poured coffee into tin cups. "Your home is peaceful," Joseph said, accepting the cup with thanks. "We try to keep it so," Maria replied. She sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup. "Though peace is not always easy to maintain." Joseph nodded, searching for words. "That cloth yesterday, I acted without understanding. I'd like to know its meaning, if you're willing to tell me." Maria's eyes grew distant. "My husband believed in building bridges between peoples. He died defending that belief." She rose and retrieved the cloth from a cedar chest. "This half was his uniform shirt. This half, my mother's beadwork. Together, they represent what he fought for, unity between two worlds." "How did he die?" Joseph asked softly. "Renegade Apache warriors rejected the peace he sought. They attacked settlers near here." Her fingers traced the cloth's patterns. "John tried to stop them, to protect both sides. They killed him for it. Us." She looked up at Joseph. "The cloth reminds us that peace is possible, even if some choose violence." Joseph's coffee grew cold in his hands as shame twisted in his gut. How many times had he chosen violence, following orders that haunted him still? "The deed Bedford showed." He said finally, "Is it real? As real as this cloth? As real as my husband's blood on that Bible?" Maria's voice was steady. "John believed sharing the water would prevent more bloodshed. He died protecting that dream." Through the window, they could see Lucia stacking wood, singing softly to herself in Spanish. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. Joseph stood, placing his cup on the table. "Thank you for the coffee, ma'am, and for sharing your story." Maria walked him to the door. "Why did you come today, Mr. Boone?" He paused, looking out at the peaceful scene before him. "Reckon I needed to know the truth," he said finally, "even if knowing it comes at a cost." The ride home gave him time to think. His ranch house felt especially empty that night as he lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. Frank's warning echoed in his mind, along with the memory of Maria's quiet strength and the meaning sewn into that cloth. Sleep eluded him, but clarity came in its place. Whatever the cost, he had to learn the truth about that deed, even if it meant losing friends, even if it meant standing alone. He had done that before. The schoolhouse bell rang through the crisp morning air as Joseph guided his wagon down Main Street. Feed sacks and supplies rattled in the back as he made his deliveries. He hadn't slept much, his mind still churning. Over Maria's story and Frank's warning, children spilled from the white-painted building for their noon recess, their voices carrying across the muddy street. Joseph barely noticed until a girl's cry cut through the general commotion. He pulled his team to a halt, recognizing Lucia's red shawl amid a circle of larger children. "Half-breed, half-breed." The cruel chant rose from several young voices. A boy grabbed at Lucia's shawl while others pushed her between them. Tears streaked her face, but she held herself straight, just like her aunt. "My mama says your kind ain't welcome here no more." One girl taunted, giving Lucia a hard shove. Joseph's boots hit the ground before he'd made a conscious decision. His shadow fell across the group as he strode forward, and the children froze at his approach. "That's enough," His deep voice boomed across the schoolyard. The bullies scattered like quail, leaving Lucia standing alone, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. The schoolmistress hurried down the steps, her face flushed. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Boone. I was just coming to no need to explain, Miss Palmer." Joseph's tone remained firm but controlled. He knelt beside Lucia, his giant frame somehow gentle. "You all right, little one?" Lucia nodded, though her lower lip trembled. "Gracias, Señor Boone. Come on, I'll take you home." He helped her into the wagon, noting how small she looked perched on the high seat as they rolled away from town. Joseph couldn't miss the stares from storekeepers and passers-by. Word would spread fast, the giant rancher defending Maria Montoya's kin. Lucia sat quietly beside him, occasionally wiping her eyes with her shawl. "Those kids," Joseph said carefully, "they're wrong to treat you that way, Amatia says." "Their hearts are still growing," Lucia replied softly. "Like young trees that need time to grow straight." Joseph glanced at the child, struck by the wisdom in her words. "Your aunt is a wise woman." When they reached the cabin, Maria rushed out at the unexpected arrival. Her face tightened with concern when she saw Lucy's tear-stained cheeks. "What happened?" She lifted her niece down, checking her for injuries. Joseph explained while unhitching his team. Maria's expression grew sad, but not surprised, as she held Lucia close. "You're very kind to bring her home, Mr. Boone." She hesitated, then added, "Would you stay for supper? It's the least I can offer." The sun was already lowering toward the mountains. Joseph knew he should refuse. Staying would only fuel the town's gossip. But something in Maria's eyes, a mixture of gratitude and loneliness, made him nod. The cabin felt warmer than his own house as Maria served a simple meal of beans, tortillas, and coffee. Lucia's spirits lifted as she told them about the book she was reading in school. Joseph found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. "I haven't seen you at prayer meetings," Maria observed as she poured more coffee, "though you came to church Sunday." Joseph stared into his cup. "Haven't prayed much since the war." "Not until yesterday." "What changed?" He met her gaze across the table. "Seen that Bible." "Your husband's blood." He struggled for words. "Made me remember things I'd rather forget. Things I did." Maria's face softened with understanding. "The war left many wounds, Mr. Boone, not all of them visible." "Joseph," he said quietly. "Please call me Joseph." They talked as the light faded outside, sharing pieces of their stories. Maria spoke of her husband's dreams for peace between peoples. Joseph admitted his shame over following orders that had destroyed native villages. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by Lucia's occasional questions or comments. When Joseph finally rose to leave, stars dotted the dark sky like scattered diamonds. The air had grown colder, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. "Thank you for the meal," he said at the door, "and for listening." Maria smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "Thank you for defending Luciella's. Not many would have done the same." The walk home under the star-filled sky gave Joseph time to think. He knew there would be consequences for his actions today. Already he could see lights in the saloon windows, where voices would be rising with drink and anger. Inside the crowded establishment, Bedford, the wealthy cattleman, held court at the bar. His voice carried over the general noise as Joseph passed. Outside, Boone's turned against his own kind. Bedford declared, "First in church, now protecting that half-breed girl. Man's forgotten which side he's on." Some ranchers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to take sides. The ripples of discord spread through the community like waves on a pond. Joseph's boots crunched on the frozen ground as he approached his barn. A lamp burned inside, unusual for this hour. He found two of his hired hands waiting, their faces set in grim lines. "We're quitting," Tom Davis announced, standing straight. "Can't work for a man who betrays his fellow ranchers. Won't find other work easy," Joseph warned quietly. "Better than being called traitors ourselves," Will Parker added. They walked past him into the night, leaving Joseph alone in the barn's shadowy interior. He stood there a long moment, surrounded by the familiar sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. The price of his choices was becoming clear. But when he remembered Lucia's tears, Maria's quiet strength, and that blood-stained Bible, he knew he couldn't have acted differently. The barn felt emptier than usual as he completed his evening chores alone, wondering how many more friends he would lose before this was over. The December wind cut sharp across the prairie, driving needles of snow against Joseph's face as he rode into town. Where friendly waves once greeted him, he now found turned backs and cold stares. Even old Tom at the general store, who'd known him 15 years, barely nodded as Joseph passed. "Heard tell that Mexican woman's got you fooled proper," someone muttered loud enough for him to hear. Joseph kept his eyes forward, though his jaw tightened. The courthouse stood stark against the gray sky, its weather-beaten boards creaking in the wind. Inside, men packed the benches, their breath visible in the chilly air. Bedford, the wealthy cattleman, stood at the front beside a distinguished-looking man Joseph recognized as Judge Harrison from Denver. "This deed," Bedford announced, holding up a yellowed paper, "proves the Montoya claim is false. Her husband signed away any water rights before his death." The judge adjusted his spectacles, studying the document. Joseph moved closer, noting details that seemed wrong, the ink too fresh in places. The signature somehow different from other papers he'd seen with Thomas Montoya's hand. "If I may, Your Honor," Joseph spoke up, his deep voice carrying over the murmurs. Heads turned, some with surprise, others with barely concealed hostility. "I've known Maria Montoya to be nothing but honest in her dealings. Her husband died protecting both settlers and peaceful Apache families. That cloth she brought to church, we don't need to hear about your sympathy for half-breeds, Boone," someone called out. Others joined in with jeers. The judge rapped his gavel. "Order, Mr. Boone has the right to speak." But the damage was done. Joseph could see in the judge's eyes that the interruption had served its purpose, painting him as an outsider, a man whose judgment couldn't be trusted. "I will review all evidence carefully," Judge Harrison declared. "Expect my ruling within 3 weeks." The crowd shuffled out into the biting wind. Joseph caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Can't trust a man who turns on his own. Probably sweet on that Mexican widow. Ain't natural. Taking their side, bone-weary." Joseph mounted his horse for the long ride home. The sun was already sinking, painting the snow-covered hills in shades of purple and gold. His mind churned with worry, not just about Maria's claim, but about his own future in this community. The first sign of trouble came when he spotted tracks in the fresh snow leading to his corral. His heart sank as he drew closer. The heavy gate hung open, swinging in the wind. Cattle tracks led in every direction across the white landscape. "Cowards," he muttered, dismounting to examine the gate. The rope hadn't broken. It had been cut clean through with a knife. There was no time to dwell on anger. Night was falling, and his scattered herd would need gathering before the temperature dropped further. Joseph lit his barn lantern, saddled his best cutting horse, and rode out into the gathering darkness. Hours passed as he worked by lantern light, following tracks and calling his cattle home. The moon rose, casting enough light to work by, but the cold grew fierce. His fingers ached on the reins and lariat as he brought in the last few strays. It was well past midnight when he finally secured the mended gate. Exhaustion dragged at him as he cared for his horse and stumbled toward his dark house. A small figure stood on his porch, and he reached instinctively for his gun before recognizing Maria's shawl. "I heard what happened at the courthouse," she said softly. "Thought you might need food after such a day." She held up a covered basket. Joseph wanted to refuse, to protect her from further gossip, but the smell of warm tortillas made his stomach growl. "Much obliged," he managed, fumbling with cold fingers to light the house lamp. Maria moved efficiently in his kitchen, setting out beans, tortillas, and hot coffee. They ate in comfortable silence until Joseph found his voice again. "The deed looks official," he admitted, "but something's not right about it." "Thomas would never have signed away the water rights," Maria said firmly. "He believed in sharing the land, in peace between peoples." She reached into her shawl and withdrew a small Bible, the same one that had lain beneath her cloth that Sunday morning. "These words gave Thomas strength," she said, opening to a marked page. "But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." The lamplight caught the dark stains on the pages as she read. Joseph listened, remembering how those same bloodstains had brought him to his knees weeks ago. "I'm afraid," he confessed quietly. "Not of them, but of losing everything I've built here." Maria looked up, her eyes full of understanding. "Faith doesn't promise an easy path, Joseph, but it does promise we won't walk it alone." She read more verses about justice and mercy, her voice steady and sure. Joseph found himself drawing strength from her words, from her unwavering belief in truth's power to prevail. The lamp burned low as they talked of smaller things: Lucia's progress in school, the weather's turn, the wild herbs Maria had dried for winter. It felt natural, sitting together in his kitchen, as if they'd known each other for years instead of weeks. When Maria finally rose to leave, Joseph insisted on riding with her home. The moon lit their way across the snow-covered prairie, their horses' hooves making soft crunching sounds in the crystalline night. At her cabin door, Maria turned to him. "Thank you for speaking up today. Not many would have risked what you did." Joseph nodded, unable to find words for the mix of emotions in his chest: fear for his ranch's future, anger at the sabotage, and something warmer when he looked at Maria's face in the moonlight. He rode home slowly, watching his breath cloud in the frigid air. The stock was safe now, but he knew this was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices between what was easy and what was right. The light in his window seemed a little less lonely as he unsaddled his horse, Maria's words about faith and justice still echoing in his mind. Sunday dawned, bright and bitter cold, the kind of morning that turned breath to ice crystals. The small church's bell rang across the frozen valley, calling the faithful to worship. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow against frost-covered windows as townspeople stamped snow from their boots. Maria entered quietly, the disputed cloth folded carefully in her arms. Lucia stayed close to her aunt's side, her dark eyes wide and watchful. A hush fell over the congregation, followed by whispers that rustled like dry leaves. Several people shifted in their pews, turning their backs. The heavy door creaked open again, and Joseph Boone's massive frame filled the entrance. Without hesitation, he strode down the aisle and took his seat beside Maria and Lucia Letters. His actions spoke louder than words, a public declaration of where he stood. More whispers erupted, some angry, others uncertain. The preacher fidgeted at his pulpit, his fingers nervously shuffling papers. Maria rose slowly, moving toward the communion table with her precious burden. Before she could unfold it, Bedford, the wealthy cattleman, half rose from his seat. "Preacher," he called out, "surely you won't allow that blasphemous. Let her lay it." Joseph's deep voice carried through the church. He stood, his height commanding attention. "That cloth ain't blasphemy. It's testimony." The preacher's Adam's apple bobbed as he looked between the two men. "Brother Boone, perhaps you'd care to explain." Joseph nodded, his weathered face solemn. That Bible beneath the cloth, the one marked with Thomas Montoya's blood, It tells a truth we all need to hear. A man died defending both settlers and peaceful Apache folk. His sacrifice deserves honor, not scorn. Maria's hands trembled as she unfolded the cloth, revealing its careful blend of cavalry blue and native beadwork. Lucia helped her spread it across the table, smoothing each corner with reverent touches. The preacher studied the cloth, then the congregation's faces. Finally, he straightened his shoulders. The cloth may stay. Let us pray. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the room. Heads bowed, some grudgingly, others with relief. Maria's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she gazed at Joseph, gratitude plain on her face. For that moment, as prayers rose to the rafters, the church felt united. Even Bedford and his supporters joined the chorus of amens after the service. The three walked home together through the crystalline afternoon. Their boots crunched in the fresh snow as Lucia ran ahead, catching snowflakes on her tongue. "Thank you," Maria said softly, "for standing up there, for making them see." Joseph adjusted his hat brim against the sun's glare. "Reckon it's time folks remembered what that good book really teaches about loving thy neighbor." They talked of simple things as they walked the weather. Lucia's reading progress, the wild turkeys Joseph had spotted near the creek. The air felt lighter, as if the morning's acceptance had thawed more than just the congregation's hearts. At Maria's cabin, she insisted on sharing coffee and fresh cornbread. They sat at her small table while Lucia practiced her letters by the window. The room glowed with warmth from the cooking fire, and for a moment it felt like peace might actually take root. Joseph rode home as the sun set, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. But the night had other plans. The moon was high when he first noticed the strange glow on the horizon. At first, he thought it might be northern lights until he realized the fire came from the direction of Maria's cabin. Dear God, no. He ran for the barn, hands shaking as he saddled his fastest horse. The gelding sensed his urgency, dancing sideways as Joseph swung into the saddle. They thundered through the darkness, the horse's hooves throwing up sprays of snow. As they crested the last rise, Joseph's worst fears were confirmed. Maria's cabin blazed against the night sky, flames already consuming the roof. Dark figures on horseback circled the inferno, their torches adding to the hellish scene. Bedford's voice carried on the wind, thick with whiskey and hate. "Let it burn. Let everyone see what happens to those who try to steal our water." Joseph urged his horse faster, his heart pounding. Where were Maria and Lucia? Had they escaped? The heat hit him like a wall as he approached, and he could hear. The horrible sound of timber cracking dot movement caught his eye to small figures huddled behind a snowbank, clutching what looked like the cloth-wrapped Bible and a single blanket. Maria held Lucia close, shielding the girl's eyes from the destruction of their home. The raiders hadn't spotted them yet. Joseph veered toward them, keeping his horse between the fire and the hiding place. He could see Bedford and his men clearly now, their faces red in the firelight as they watched Maria's world burn. The cabin's roof collapsed with a shower of sparks that lit up the night like evil stars. Maria stifled a sob, and Lucia buried her face in her aunt's skirts. Everything they owned, every piece of their life together, was being devoured by the flames. Joseph's rage burned hotter than the fire, but he forced it down. Right now, Maria and Lucia needed safety more than he needed vengeance. He dismounted quietly beside them, his voice barely a whisper. "Can you ride?" Maria nodded, clutching their few saved treasures. The Bible, the cloth, a small bag that was all they'd managed to grab when the first torch had hit their roof. "Take my horse. Go to my place. I'll handle this." But Maria caught his arm. "No, come with us, please." Her eyes reflected the flames, but it was fear for him, not herself, that filled them. "They're drunk, dangerous. There will be time for..." just as tomorrow. Joseph hesitated, every instinct screaming to confront the raiders. But Maria was right. In their current state, Bedford's men might do worse than burn buildings. He helped them mount, then swung up behind them. As they rode away from the inferno, Lucia's tears froze on her cheeks, and Maria held tight to the cloth that had started it all. Behind them, Bedford's drunken laughter echoed across the snow-covered valley. A sound that promised this night's violence was only the beginning. Joseph's horse thundered through the night, hooves pounding against frozen ground as they approached Maria's burning cabin. The flames reached skyward, painting the snow-covered landscape in hellish orange. His heart hammered as he spotted Bedford's men circling the inferno on horseback, their drunken shouts carrying over the roar of the fire. He dismounted quickly, scanning the chaos for any sign of Maria and Lucy Ellis. Smoke stung his eyes as he moved closer, calling their names in a harsh whisper. A muffled cough caught his attention, and he found them huddled behind a snow-covered woodpile. Maria held Lucia tight against her chest, both of them shivering violently in the bitter cold. "Thank the Lord," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside them. "Are you hurt?" Maria's face was streaked with soot, and she cradled her right hand close. The flames, when we grabbed the cloth and Bible, her voice broke as she showed him an angry red burn across her palm. Without hesitation, Joseph shrugged off his heavy winter coat and wrapped it around their shoulders. Lucia's small frame shook with silent sobs as she clutched the cloth, Bible, their only salvaged possessions from the burning cabin. "My horse is just beyond those trees," Joseph said softly. "Can you walk?" Maria nodded, though her teeth chattered. He helped them up, keeping his broad frame between them and the raiders' view. They crept through shadows until they reached his horse, the loyal animal standing steady despite the nearby chaos. Joseph lifted Lucia into the saddle first, then helped Maria mount behind her. He took the reins and led them on foot, choosing a roundabout path through the darkness to avoid being spotted. The snow began falling harder, thick flakes swirling in the wind and covering their tracks. The journey to his ranch seemed endless. Every snap of a branch made them freeze. Every distant shout had them holding their breath. Lucia hadn't spoken a word since they fled, her small hands white-knuckled on the saddle horn. Finally, Joseph's ranch house emerged from the gloom. He hurried them inside, where embers still glowed in the hearth. Quickly, he built up the fire, while Maria sank into his old leather chair, exhaustion etched on her face. Lucia curled up on the bearskin rug nearby, wrapped in the coat that dwarfed her tiny frame. "Let me see that hand," Joseph said gently, retrieving his medicine kit from a shelf. He worked with careful tenderness, cleaning the burn with cool water before applying salve and wrapping it in clean bandages. Maria winced, but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, watching him work. "We've brought such trouble to your door." Joseph shook his head. "No apologies needed. What Bedford and his men did tonight, that's pure evil." He found extra blankets in his chest, tucking one around Lucia's shoulders. The girl had finally drifted into fitful sleep, though tears still stained her cheeks. Maria reached out, with her uninjured hand, to smooth her niece's hair. Outside, the snowfall grew heavier, the wind whistling through cracks in the log walls. Joseph added another log to the fire, watching the flames dance. The same element that had destroyed their home now offered comfort and warmth. Joseph Maria's voice was barely audible above the crackling fire. The treaty papers, they were sewn inside the cloth's lining. She closed her eyes, pain crossing her features. "I saw Bedford grab it when we fled. He must have known somehow." Joseph's jaw tightened. "I saw him too, riding away with something tucked in his coat. The papers would give him reason enough to burn you out." He met her gaze steadily. "But I swear to you, Maria, I'll stand with you through this. We'll find a way to prove your claim." Fear flickered in her eyes. "They'll come after you, too. Your ranch, your reputation. Let them try." His voice was firm, though his own fear gnawed at his gut. Everything he'd built could crumble for taking this stand. But watching Maria tend to Lucia with such gentle strength, he knew he couldn't choose differently. Maria studied him in the firelight. "Perhaps," she said softly, "this is why God led you to kneel that day in church, not just for the Bible's testimony, but for what was to come." Joseph considered her words, remembering how that moment had shattered his carefully constructed solitude. He'd spent years building walls around his heart, trying to forget the war's horrors. Now those walls were crumbling, and two souls needed his protection. He made up a bed for Maria near the fire, using his best quilts. She settled, Lucia beside her, the girl instinctively curling closer to her aunt's warmth. Joseph took his old army cat, positioning it between them and the door. Long after Maria's breathing had settled into sleep's rhythm, Joseph lay awake. The fire's glow cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the snow continued its silent fall. Outside, his life of solitude was over. He could feel it as surely as he felt the cold seeping through the floorboards. But as he watched over his sleeping guests, he realized he didn't mourn that loss. The night stretched on, and Joseph kept his vigil. Whatever tomorrow brought, he would face it protecting these two souls who had awakened his dormant heart. His ranch house, for so long a lonely shelter, had become something more, a sanctuary for this newfound family. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of pink and gold as Joseph saddled his horse. The previous night's snow lay pristine across the ranch, broken only by his boot prints as he'd made his morning rounds. Inside the house, he could hear Maria moving about, already up and working despite her injured hand. The sound of life in his once silent home stirred something deep in his chest. The ride into town felt longer than usual, each hoof beat matching the rhythm of his troubled thoughts. Main Street was already bustling when he arrived, though several townspeople hurriedly crossed to avoid his path. Their whispers followed him like shadows as he dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Cutter sat behind his desk, boots propped up, seemingly absorbed in yesterday's newspaper. He barely glanced up when Joseph entered, the floorboards creaking beneath the rancher's weight. "Suppose you're here about the fire," Cutter drawled, finally setting the paper aside. Joseph planted his hands on the desk, looming over the lawman. "You know good and well who did it, Sheriff. Bedford and his men were seen riding away." "Seen by who?" Cutter's voice held a note of challenge. "You, the widow." That ain't exactly unbiased testimony. Their tracks were clear as day in the snow. Joseph insisted, his deep voice rumbling with barely contained anger. And Bedford had reason enough, stealing those treaty papers. The sheriff sighed, dropping his boots to the floor. "Look here, Boone, unless you can bring me something solid. Linking Bedford to that fire, my hands are tied. Ain't no law against riding near someone's property at night." Joseph straightened, disgust evident on his weathered face. "So that's how it is. Justice only works for certain folks. Now don't go putting words in my mouth." Cutter stood, adjusting his badge. "I'm saying proof matters. You used to understand that before you started." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Before you took up with certain people, the implication hung heavy in the air between them." Joseph's hands clenched into fists, but he kept them at his sides. "I understand plenty, Sheriff, including which side of right you're standing on." He turned and strode out, the door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. Outside, he found 3 of his ranch hands waiting, their expressions grim. Tom, his most experienced cowboy, stepped forward. "Mr. Boone, we've come to collect our wages. All of you." Joseph looked at each man in turn, reading the answer in their averted eyes. "Way we see it," Tom continued. "You're fixing to lose everything, siding with, well, with the wrong people. Can't expect us to go down with you." Joseph nodded slowly, his jaw tight. Without a word, he withdrew his wallet and counted out their pay. The men took their money and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the morning sun. The ride back to his ranch was heavy with the weight of consequence. More cattle to tend alone, more fence lines to ride, more work than one man could manage. Yet, as his house came into view, something shifted in his chest. Smoke curled cheerfully from the chimney, and through the window he could see Maria moving about his kitchen. Her presence had already transformed the space. The curtains were drawn back to let in light, and the few plates he owned were arranged neatly on the shelf rather than stacked, haphazardly as he'd always left them, in the barn. He found Lucia carefully brushing his bay mare's coat, speaking to the horse in soft Spanish. The animal's head was lowered contentedly, obviously enjoying the attention. The girl looked up as Joseph entered, offering a shy smile that reminded him why his stand was worth any cost. "You have gentle hands with horses," he said, hanging up his saddle. "Tia Maria says animals no good hearts," Lucia replied, running the brush along the mare's flank. "Even when people don't." The wisdom in her young voice caught him off guard. Before he could respond, Maria appeared in the barn doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Supper's nearly ready," she announced. "I hope you don't mind. I found some vegetables in your root cellar." Joseph followed them back to the house, noticing how Maria had swept his porch clean of snow. Inside, the transformation was even more apparent. His sparse furnishings hadn't changed, but the space felt warmer somehow. Lived in, they gathered around his small table, where Maria had managed to turn his basic provisions into a proper meal. Steam rose from bowls of bean soup, and the cornbread smelled better than anything that had come from his oven in years. "Lost my last hands today," Joseph said quietly, breaking the silence. "Won't be easy managing alone." Maria looked up from helping Lucia cut her cornbread. "You're not alone, Joseph. Could lose the whole ranch over this," he admitted, voicing his deepest fear. "Bedford has influence. Banks listen to men like him. My husband used to say that faith isn't measured in acres," Maria replied gently. "It's measured in the strength to stand for what's right, even when standing alone." She touched the Bible resting on the sideboard. "Though you're not alone in this either." Joseph considered her words as they ate. The house that had echoed with emptiness for so long now held the soft sounds of shared meals and quiet conversation. Lucia's small laugh when Maria told her to mind her manners. The clink of spoons against bowls. The crackle of the hearth fire. Later that night, Joseph made his final checks of the property. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked the corrals, counting his remaining cattle in the moonlight. The ranch felt more vulnerable than ever, but also fuller, as if its very walls had been waiting for the warmth of family to fill them. He paused by the barn door, looking back at his house. Light spilled from the windows, and he could see Maria helping Lucia prepare for bed through the glass. The sight stirred something he'd thought long buried, a longing for more than mere survival, for the kind of life that made a house into Sestono. A home. The night air carried a bite of winter, reminding him of all he stood to lose. Yet, watching the lamplight dance across his window panes, Joseph realized he'd already gained something far more precious than land or cattle. He'd found purpose. Again, and perhaps even faith. The telegram's arrival sent ripples through the small mountain town. Joseph stood at the post office counter, reading the crisp paper with furrowed brows. The judge would return in 3 days, far sooner than anyone expected. His stomach tightened at the news outside. Winter sunshine glinted off fresh snow. As Joseph mounted his horse, the ride to Maria's temporary lodgings at the widow Johnson's house seemed shorter than usual. his mind racing with plans. Maria listened quietly as he shared the news, her dark eyes thoughtful. "We should speak with Reverend Thomas," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter. "He's been here longer than most." Joseph nodded, and soon they were making their way to the small white church. The Reverend was tending the wood stove when they arrived, his collar loosened against the heat. He straightened at their entrance, brushing ash from his hands. "I've been expecting you," he said, gesturing to the front pew. This business with the judge returning, he trailed off, looking troubled. They settled into the wooden bench. The chapel quiet except for the pop and crackle of burning wood. Reverend Thomas remained standing, pacing slightly as if wrestling with something internal. "There's something you should know," he began, his voice heavy. "Something I should have said sooner." He stopped pacing and faced them directly. "Before I came here, I served as chaplain at Fort Garland." Maria leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Joseph watched the Reverend's face intently. "I was there the day your husband signed those treaty papers," the Reverend continued, addressing Maria letters. "It wasn't just some backroom deal like Bedford claims. There were proper witnesses, Army officers, Indian agents, territorial representatives." Joseph's deep voice broke the silence that followed. "You saw this yourself?" "With my own eyes." The Reverend sank onto a nearby chair. "I blessed the proceedings. Prayed for peace between all peoples." He looked down at his hands. "I should have spoken up when Bedford first made his accusations, but I feared." He shook his head. "Well, I feared many things, none of them worth the cost of silence." Maria's voice was soft but steady. "Would you testify to this before the judge?" "Yes," the Reverend said firmly. "It's time I did what's right." Meanwhile, across town, young Lucia had slipped into Mason's general store for supplies. She moved quietly through the aisles, trying to avoid attention when voices from behind. The leather goods rack caught her ear. "Pa says Mr. Bedford's got them papers locked up tight in his strongbox," a boy whispered excitedly. "Says nobody'll ever find them there." "That old box in his study?" another boy replied. "The one with all them fancy locks." Lucia's heart pounded as she listened, carefully keeping her eyes on the shelf before her. The boys continued bragging about their parents' knowledge until Mrs. Mason's sharp voice called them to the counter. That evening, as darkness settled over the valley, Lucia shared what she'd overheard. They sat around the Widow Johnson's kitchen table, the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Joseph's massive hands clenched into fists as he listened. "I could end this tonight," he growled, rising from his chair. "One visit to Bedford's ranch? No." Maria stood quickly, placing her hand on his arm. "Violence won't bring justice, Joseph. It will only prove them right about us." "She's right," the Reverend added. He had joined them after supper to continue their discussion. "We have the law on our side now. My testimony, combined with the evidence of tampering, it's enough to make the judge look harder at Bedford's claims." Joseph worked his jaw, clearly struggling with the decision. The old ways of frontier justice pulled at him, simple, direct, final. But Maria's touch on his arm carried its own power, a gentle reminder of all they truly fought for. "There are better ways to fight," Maria said softly. "Ways that don't require fists." Finally, Joseph's shoulders relaxed slightly. "All right," he conceded. "We'll do this proper. But if Bedford tries anything, then we'll face it together," Maria finished firmly. The Reverend left shortly after, promising to prepare his testimony for the judge's arrival. Snow had begun falling again, thick flakes swirling in the lamplight. As Joseph and Maria prepared for their ride back to his ranch, Lucia was already asleep upstairs at the widow's. Safe until morning, they rode side by side through the gathering storm, their horses picking carefully along the snowy trail. Joseph kept one hand near his gun, eyes scanning the darkness ahead. The weather worked in their favor, making any ambush unlikely. But years of frontier life had taught him caution. Yet, despite his vigilance, Joseph felt an unfamiliar peace settling over him. Maria rode beside him, straight-backed and sure in. Her saddle, her quiet faith, somehow stronger than any weapon. The snow muffled all sound except their horses' hooves and the occasional creak of leather. "I've spent so many years solving problems with force," Joseph said suddenly, his voice barely carrying through the snow. "Maybe I forgot there were other ways." Maria turned slightly in her saddle. "Faith doesn't mean we're weak, Joseph. Sometimes. It takes more strength to wait for justice than to demand it." He nodded, understanding finally reaching deeper than words. The snow continued falling around them as they rode. Two figures moving through the white night, carrying hope like a lantern before them. The courthouse loomed against the gray winter sky, its wooden steps creaking under the weight of townsfolk filing inside. Joseph held the heavy door for Maria and Lucia, noting how the little girl pressed closer to her aunt's side. The room smelled of wet wool and wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove in the corner. Judge Harrison settled behind his broad desk, his spectacles catching the weak light from the frosted windows. The assembled crowd shuffled and murmured, creating two distinct groups, ranchers on one side, Maria supporters on the other. The space between felt as wide as a canyon. Bedford, the wealthy cattleman, rose from his chair with a flourish. His expensive coat gleamed with brass buttons as he approached the judge's desk. A leather portfolio tucked under his arm drew all eyes. "Your Honor," Bedford announced, his voice carrying to the rafters, "I have here the original deed of sale." He withdrew a yellow document with a practiced gesture. "As you can see, Mrs. Montoya's husband sold his water rights outright, for a fair price in coin, I might add." The judge accepted the paper, studying it through his spectacles. Joseph leaned forward, straining to see. Even from his position, certain details jumped out, the ink too fresh in places, the signatures too crisp for a document supposedly years old. A wave of mutters swept the courtroom as Bedford continued. "The terms are quite clear. Complete. Transfer of rights, no provisions for shared access. A simple business transaction." Maria's hand tightened on the arm of her chair. Joseph could see the color draining from her face as she stared at the altered treaty, her husband's legacy twisted into a weapon against her. "This is forgery." Joseph's deep voice boomed across the room as he surged to his feet. His shadow fell across Bedford's document. The paper's been changed. The original treaty guaranteed shared water rights for both ranchers and Apache families. The judge raised his hand for silence as the crowd erupted. "Order, Mr. Boone. Do you have evidence to support this accusation?" "I do, Your Honor, Reverend." Thomas stepped forward from his place near the wall. His collar seemed to tighten around his throat as all eyes turned to him. "I was present at Fort Garland when the original treaty was signed. As chaplain there. I witnessed the proceedings. Myself." The Reverend's quiet voice carried authority as he described the scene. Territorial officials gathered around the fort's massive oak table, Maria's husband and Apache leaders seated as equals. The careful translation of terms ensuring all parties understood the agreement for shared access to the water. It was a model of cooperation, the Reverend concluded. A path toward peace that many of us prayed for. Bedford's face had darkened during the testimony. "A preacher's memory from years ago hardly overturns a written deed," he sneered. "Judge." Harrison removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief. The simple action somehow heightened the tension in the room. "This is a serious matter," he said at last. "Reverend Thomas's testimony carries weight, but Mr. Bedford's document appears official." He replaced his spectacles. "I'll need to consult territorial records and gather statements from other Fort Garland officials before making my final ruling." A mix of protests and satisfied murmurs filled the courthouse. The judge rapped his gavel. This hearing is postponed until such evidence can be gathered. Court dismissed. The crowd spilled out onto the courthouse steps where fat snowflakes had begun to fall. Bedford shouldered past Joseph, a smirk twisting his features. "Enjoy what's left of your ranch, Boone," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "When this is settled, you'll be finished in this valley. No one crosses me and keeps their place." Joseph's hands curled into fists at his sides. The urge to answer Bedford's threat with violence surged through him. One solid punch could wipe away that smugness. But Maria's presence beside him cooled his anger. He took a deep breath of sharp winter air. "Come on," he said quietly to Maria and Lucia Letters. "Let's head home." The snow fell harder as they rode, transforming the landscape into a white blanket. That muffled all sound. By the time they reached Joseph's ranch, their coats were covered in powder, and darkness was settling over the valley. Inside, Joseph built up the fire while Maria helped Lucia out of her wet things. The familiar tasks helped ease some of the day's tension, but worry still hung heavy in the air. "I wanted to break him in half," Joseph admitted as he stood from the hearth. "The way he stood there, lying about your husband's treaty, Maria. Hung their wet coats near the fire. Tina, I saw it in your face." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the flames. "But you didn't. You chose a better path." "Fat lot of good it did us," he growled. "That forged treaty looked mighty convincing." "The truth will come out," Maria said softly. "We must have faith." She knelt beside the hearth, her skirts spreading around her like settling wings. After a moment, Joseph joined her, his large frame awkward in the position he'd avoided for so many years. "Lord," Maria began, her voice barely above a whisper, "we ask for your guidance. Let justice prevail. Give us strength to face whatever comes with dignity and grace." Joseph's deep voice joined hers, and wisdom to know the right path. The fire crackled softly as they prayed, while outside the snow continued to fall, covering the valley in pristine white, as if trying to blanket away the day's bitter confrontations with its pure and gentle peace. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale winter colors as Joseph led his bay horse from the barn. His breath frosted in the crisp morning air while he cinched the saddle tight and secured his bedroll. The animal stomped restlessly. Sensing the long journey ahead, Maria emerged from the house carrying provisions wrapped in oilcloth. She wore her warmest coat, patched but sturdy, with a thick wool scarf around her neck. Her dark eyes held determination despite the challenging path before them. "You don't have to come," Joseph said quietly, securing the supplies to his saddle. "The trail to the territorial capital will be rough." "This is my fight too," Maria replied, adjusting her own mount's bridle. "My husband's memory deserves nothing." Less Reverend Thomas rode up, his gray gelding's hooves crunching through the frozen snow. He carried saddlebags full of documents, copies of fort records, his own written testimony, and letters from other witnesses to the original treaty. Signing, they had left Lucia with Widow Chen, who ran the town's laundry. The widow had lost her own daughter to fever years ago and welcomed the child's company. Still, Maria's eyes lingered on the direction of town, her heart clearly torn. "She'll be safe there," Joseph assured her. "Sarah Chen is good people, Atifs. To herself, minds her own business." "I know," Maria sighed. "It's just, I've never been apart from her since my sister died." The three riders set out as the sun cleared the mountains. Their horses picked their way carefully through snow-covered trails, hooves breaking through frozen crust to softer powder beneath. The morning remained quiet, except for the creak of saddle leather and the soft huffing of their mounts. By midday, they had climbed into steeper country. The trail wound through stands of pine and aspen, their branches heavy with snow. Joseph led the way. His broad shoulders hunched against the cold wind that puss had begun to blow down from the peaks. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of jerky and hard biscuits. Maria pulled her coat tighter as she sat on a fallen log, watching Joseph check the animal's legs for any signs of strain. 2 more days of this, Reverend Thomas said, stamping his feet to keep warm. God willing, the weather holds. The afternoon brought heavier clouds and occasional flurries. The wind picked up, driving loose snow into their faces. They pressed on until dusk began to settle over the mountains. Joseph found them a sheltered spot near a frozen creek where dense pines offered some protection from the wind. They worked together efficiently to make camp. Joseph gathering firewood while Maria cleared snow from a patch of ground. The Reverend tended to the horses, making sure they were properly picketed where they could paw through the snow for grass. Once the fire was blazing, they huddled close to its warmth. Maria produced a pot of beans and salt pork she'd prepared before leaving, setting it near the flames to heat. The familiar smell of camp cooking helped ease some of the day's tension. After they'd eaten, silence settled over the camp. Joseph stared into the fire, his face troubled in the flickering light. Maria watched him, sensing the weight of unspoken words. During the war, he finally said, his voice rough, "I did things that haunt me still." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks swirling up into the darkness. There was this village up near the Kansas border. We had orders to clear the area. The colonel said they were helping raiders. Maria and the Reverend remained silent, letting him speak at his own pace. "I led the torch detail myself," Joseph continued. "Didn't even question the orders, just did it. Watched those homes burn. Heard the screams." His massive shoulders slumped. "Been trying to forget ever since." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Then Maria reached out, placing her small hand over his large, calloused one. "God's mercy is greater than any sin," she said softly. "My people have a saying, even the deepest wound can become a door to healing if we let the light in." Joseph looked at their joined hands, then up at her face. The firelight caught tears in his eyes. "How can you even touch me, knowing what I've done?" "Because I see who you are now," she answered. "The man who knelt before my husband's Bible, the man who defends my niece, the man riding through snow to help us seek justice." She squeezed his hand. "That is who God sees too." Reverend Thomas cleared his throat. "The Lord's work isn't just in forgiving us, Joseph, it's in transforming us, using even our darkest moments to shape us into instruments of His peace." The wind sighed through the pines as they sat in companionable silence. Eventually, they rolled out their bedding near the fire. Joseph took first watch, his broad figure a reassuring presence in the firelight as the others drifted off to sleep. The next day dawned clear but bitterly cold. Frost had formed on their blankets, and the creek ice crackled like gunshots in the morning stillness. They ate a quick breakfast of cold biscuits and mounted up, eager to get moving and warm their stiff muscles. The wind cut through their clothes as they rode, carrying the bite of snow from the high peaks. But they pressed on, taking turns breaking trail through the deepening drifts. The horses plodded steadily forward, their breath streaming behind them like smoke, as the sun climbed higher. Joseph began to recognize landmarks he remembered from previous trips to the territorial capital. A distinctive rock formation, a lightning struck pine, the remains of an old way station. "Should make town by nightfall tomorrow," he called back to the others. Maria nodded, her face set with determination despite the cold. The Reverend's nose and cheeks were red from the wind, but his eyes showed the same resolve, looking at his companions. Joseph felt something stir in his chest, a feeling of purpose stronger than any he'd known since the war. This wasn't just about land or water rights anymore. It was about justice, redemption, and the chance to stand for something right. The three riders pressed on through the afternoon, their horses' hooves breaking trail through the endless white of the snow-covered mountains. Behind them, their tracks stretched back like a testimony to their journey. Ahead, somewhere beyond the next rise, lay hope for justice and the chance to make things right. The territorial governor's office stood proud against the winter sky, its red brick walls dusted with snow. Joseph, Maria, and Reverend Thomas climbed the worn stone steps, their boots leaving wet tracks on the polished floor inside. The journey had left them weary, their clothes travel-stained. But determination kept their backs straight as they approached the clerk's desk. "We need to see Governor Harrison," Joseph said, his deep voice carrying across the quiet office. "It's about a water rights dispute." The clerk looked up, taking in their road-worn appearance with raised eyebrows. "The governor is quite busy." "With it involves treaty rights," Reverend Thomas interrupted, stepping forward. "And evidence of forgery. I was witness to the original signing at Fort Garland." Those words caught attention. Within minutes, they were led down a long hallway to a large office where Governor Harrison sat behind a massive oak desk. Maps covered the walls, and a coal fire burned in the hearth. The governor was a lean man with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Please, sit." He gestured to the chairs before his desk. "Tell me what brings you through this weather." For the next hour, they laid out their case. The preacher spoke first, his voice steady as he described the original treaty signing. "I was serving as chaplain at Fort Garland when Private David Montoya brought the Apache delegation to negotiate water rights," he explained, pulling documents from his satchel. "I witnessed him arrange shared access to the river valley. The agreement was meant to promote peace between settlers and tribes." Maria sat quietly as the Reverend described her husband's work, her hands folded in her lap. When her turn came, she reached into her shawl and withdrew the blood-stained Bible. "This was my husband's," she said softly, placing it on the governor's desk. "He carried it the day he died, defending both settlers and Apache from renegades who wanted war." Her voice grew stronger. The treaty was his legacy, a path to peace. Now certain men want to destroy that dream. Governor Harrison carefully opened the Bible, studying the dark stains on its pages. His expression remained neutral, but his fingers traced the dried blood with reverence. Joseph leaned forward in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "Sir, I've watched good men turn against their neighbors over this. They've burned Maria's home, scattered my cattle, all because we stand for what's right." His large hands clenched. "The cattleman claims the treaty sold the rights outright. But that paper's been tampered with." The governor nodded slowly, examining both documents spread before him, the preacher's copy of the original deed and the altered version from town. Minutes ticked by as he studied them, comparing signatures and wording. Maria's fingers worried at her shawl. Joseph found himself holding his breath. Even Reverend Thomas, usually so composed, shifted restlessly in his chair. At last, Governor Harrison looked up. "The forgery is clear," he said firmly. "The altered ink, the changed dates, it's crude work." He set both papers down. "Moreover, I have records of Private Montoya's service." His commanding officer praised his work building trust with the tribes. Hope began to bloom in Maria's eyes. The governor continued, his tone growing stronger. "The original treaty stands. The Apache families, through Mrs. Montoya, hold legal water rights to share the valley's river." He fixed them each with a steady gaze. "I'll have official papers drawn up immediately. The town must honor this agreement." Maria covered her face with trembling hands, tears slipping between her fingers. Joseph reached over and clasped her shoulder, his own eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you, sir," Reverend Thomas said quietly. This will mean peace for many families. Justice may not always be swift, the governor replied, but it must be served. I'll send word to the territorial marshal to investigate the arson and intimidation. He rose, signaling the end of their meeting. The clerk will have your papers ready within the hour. They filed out of the office, relief making their steps lighter despite their exhaustion. In the hallway, Maria turned to Joseph, wiping tears from her cheeks. God is good, she whispered. Even through all this winter's trials, he had a plan. Joseph nodded, too moved for words. The Reverend smiled at them both, clapping Joseph's broad shoulder. Later that evening, they found rooms at a modest boarding house near the town square. The landlady, seeing their weariness, brought up bowls of hot beef stew and fresh bread. They sat around a small table in Maria's room, warming themselves by the pot-bellied stove. First hot meal in 3 days, Joseph said appreciatively, soaking up gravy with a chunk of bread. Maria cupped her hands around her bowl, savoring its warmth. I can hardly believe it's done, she murmured. After all these months of fear, the Lord's timing is perfect, Reverend Thomas reminded them, even when we can't see the path ahead. Outside their window, church bells began to ring, their sweet tones muffled by falling snow. The sound carried peace like a blessing over the sleeping town. Maria closed her eyes, listening. David would be proud, she said softly. His work for peace will live on. Joseph watched her in the lamplight, seeing strength and grace in her tired features. His hand found hers across the table, and she turned, her palm up to meet his calloused fingers. The bells continued their evening song as the three travelers sat together, sharing warmth and victory and the simple comfort of hot food after a long journey. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The ride home, facing the town, rebuilding what was lost. But tonight, in this quiet room, justice had been served. And that was enough. The journey back to town took 2 long days through deepening snow. Joseph's horse led their small party, breaking trail while Maria and Reverend Thomas followed. The governor's sealed documents rode safe in Joseph's saddlebags, wrapped carefully in oiled leather. They crested the final ridge overlooking the valley just as morning sun touched the church steeple. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the town stirred to life below them. Maria drew in a sharp breath, remembering her burned cabin, but Joseph's steady presence beside her gave comfort. Word of their return spread quickly. By the time they reached the courthouse steps, a crowd had gathered. The cattleman stood at the front, his face dark with anger as Joseph produced the governor's ruling. The sheriff read the documents aloud, his voice carrying across the hushed street. When he reached the part about the forged treaty, all eyes turned to the cattleman. The man's face went pale, then red with rage. This is nonsense, he shouted, pushing through the crowd. You've all been fooled by this woman and her giant friend. The evidence was clear. The sheriff held up both documents, the original and the forged version, showing where dates had been altered and signatures changed. The townspeople began to murmur, their sympathy shifting as truth came to light. The cattleman looked around wildly, seeing former allies step back from him. In a sudden move, he shoved past the sheriff and ran for his horse. He swung into the saddle and spurred hard toward the hills, leaving a spray of snow behind him. Get a posse together, the sheriff ordered, already moving toward the stables. He won't get far. Joseph turned to Maria, who stood quietly watching the scene unfold. Let's get you home to Lucia, he said gently. They rode to Joseph's ranch, where the widow's house sat just visible through the trees. Before they reached the yard, the door flew open. Lucia burst out, running through knee-deep snow. Tia Maria, she cried, throwing herself into her aunt's arms as Maria dismounted. Joseph watched their reunion, his heart full. But more surprises waited. Throughout the afternoon, wagons began arriving at his ranch. Neighbors came with lumber, tools, and willing hands. Men who had turned away from him days ago now approached with shamefaced apologies. "We were wrong," one old rancher admitted, hat in hand. "Let us help rebuild the cabin. It's the least we can do." By sunset, the foundation was already marked out near the original site. Maria walked the outline, touching the stakes with trembling fingers while Lucia danced around her. Chattering about where her bed would go, as darkness fell, they gathered at the church. Lanterns glowed in windows, and the small building filled quickly. Maria carried her cloth forward, and this time no one spoke against her as she laid it reverently across the communion table. Joseph walked beside her, his giant frame moving carefully through the crowded aisle. Together, they knelt before the table where he had first fallen weeks ago. But now there was no shame in his posture, only peaceful certainty as he bowed his head. Next to Maria's, Reverend Thomas's voice rose in the quiet sanctuary. "Let us pray for healing in our community," he said, "for forgiveness, for unity, and for the wisdom to see God's children in all faces." The congregation bowed as one, humbled by justice and mercy. Snow fell softly outside the windows, covering the valley in clean white, like grace made visible across the land. The spring thaw came gently to the valley. Melting snow fed the river until it sang with fresh life, while green shoots pushed through softening earth. Maria's rebuilt cabin stood proud near the flowing water, its new timber still golden in the morning light. The neighbors had worked together through winter's last days, raising walls twice as thick as before, adding a covered porch where Maria could weave in summer shade. Dawn painted the sky in soft pink as townspeople gathered at the river's edge. The air held mornings, chill, but sunshine promised warmth to come. Reverend Thomas stood knee-deep in the flowing water, his black coat buttoned against the cold as he waited to perform the baptisms. Lucia stepped forward, her dark eyes bright with joy. She wore a clean white dress, and her black hair was neatly braided. Maria squeezed her hand once before letting her wade into the river. The girl gasped at the cold, but kept moving, trust evident in every step. "Do you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior?" Reverend Thomas asked, his voice carrying across the quiet gathering. "I do," Luque answered clearly, her smile shy but certain. The preacher lowered her gently into the water and raised her up again. Maria stood ready with the restored cloth, the same one that had caused such strife months ago. She wrapped it around Lucia's shoulders like a shawl, pulling her close as happy tears flowed down her cheeks. Joseph watched from nearby, his weathered face soft with pride. The preacher turned to address the congregation, gesturing toward Joseph and Mariellis. "Look here at God's handiwork," he said. "Through their example of mercy and reconciliation, our community has healed. Let us remember this day." As the townspeople began to disperse, heading home for Sunday dinner, Joseph and Maria lingered by the rushing water. The cloth around Lucia's shoulders caught the morning breeze as she played with other children nearby. Joseph took Maria's hand, his touch gentle despite his calloused palm. "Maria," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about our future. Would you consider building a life together? You, me, and Luke." Maria's smile bloomed slowly, like the spring itself. "Yes," she answered, hope clear in her voice. "Yes, I would." The cloth fluttered on the drying line later that morning, catching the spring sunshine. What had once divided them now united three hearts into one family. Justice and redemption woven together as surely as its threads. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.